My HOA put 10 commercial skyscrapers on my family's fields, and I let them do it. The HOA president, Diane, just laughed as bulldozers tore through the land my father left me, the same land where my daughter felt safe. She waved a stack of papers in my face, telling me I was beaten, that the construction was unstoppable. But while she was busy building her concrete empire, she had no idea that every single floor they built was part of my secret revenge plan. She thought she was erasing my past. She was actually building my future. Where are you watching this unfold from? Drop it in the comments because this comeback is one for the history books. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied off their own land by a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe because you're about to see justice served cold. The noise wasn't just loud, it felt personal. A low, grinding growl that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the coffee cup on my nightstand. It was 6 in the morning, the sky still a bruised purple, and something was chewing up my land. I threw on a pair of jeans and work boots and stormed out the back door, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure disbelief. There it was. A yellow bulldozer, its metal claw gouging deep, muddy furrows into the west field. My field. And standing beside it, arms crossed, was Diane Wexler, the HOA president, wearing a smirk that could curdle milk. She held a clipboard like a scepter, her posture radiating a smug satisfaction that made my stomach clench. Standing just behind her was Greg Mallory, her little enforcer, rocking on his heels and trying to look official in his windbreaker, with the HOA logo stitched over the heart. He looked like a man who had been waiting his whole life for a reason to tell someone else what to do. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I yelled, the morning air turning my words to steam. The bulldozer operator cut the engine, and the sudden silence was more jarring than the noise. Diane didn't even flinch. She took a deliberate step forward, tapping her clipboard. "Good morning, Jack. We're just enforcing county zoning regulations. Your fence line is encroaching on designated community property. We sent you a notice." I hadn't received any notice. I checked my mail every day. This was a lie, and she knew it was a lie. And the smile on her face told me she enjoyed it. She was waving a sheaf of papers, the official-looking letterhead a blur from 10 feet away. It was pure performance. Greg puffed out his chest. "You're in violation, Mr. Reynolds. It's all right here. We're just correcting the boundary." Correcting the boundary? They were 10 yards inside my property line, tearing up ground my father had ceded himself 50 years ago. This land wasn't just dirt and grass to me. It was the place Dad taught me how to fix an engine. It was where my wife and I had picnics before she passed, lying on a blanket and watching the stars come out, feeling like the only two people in the world. It was where I had set up a small, quiet garden for my daughter, Maria. Just a few simple rows of flowers and herbs, but it was her space. Her therapist said she needed a place that felt safe, a place where she could just be. The bulldozer's tracks were now sunk deep into her sanctuary. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Diane, that's my property. My deed is filed with the county. You know exactly where the line is." I pointed to the old oak tree that had marked the boundary for nearly a century. "The line is there. It's always been there." She just shook her head, a picture of condescending pity. "I'm afraid your records are outdated, Jack. The board approved a resurvey last spring. This is all HOA common area now. You'll be fined for the unapproved fencing, of course, and for the cost of its removal." The sheer nerve of it almost knocked me off my feet. They were trespassing, destroying my property, and were going to bill me for it. I told them to get their machine and get off my land. I said it calmly, but with a tone that left no room for misunderstanding. Diane's smile tightened. "If you interfere, we'll have the sheriff remove you." I looked over at the bulldozer operator, a young guy who suddenly seemed very interested in a spot on his dashboard. He wasn't meeting my eyes. He was just a guy doing a job, caught in the middle of her power trip. I spent the rest of the day on the phone. I called the HOA office and got a recording. I called my lawyer, who told me to document everything, but warned that fighting an HOA was like punching water, frustrating and expensive. I called 3 different board members, and only one called me back. It was Ellie Parks, the secretary, who just repeated Diane's script, her voice a nervous whisper. "I'm sorry, Jack, but the board's decision is final. The documents are all in order." The next morning, there was a notice taped to my front door, a fine for unauthorized landscaping. The day after that, another one for improperly maintained fence line. Diane had Greg Mallory walking the perimeter of my property twice a day, clipboard in hand, looking for anything he could write up. A weed here, a patch of dry grass there. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, designed to bleed me out, to make me give up. My neighbors saw it happening. Tom Granger, a retired Army engineer who lived 2 houses down, came by with a cup of coffee. He just stood with me by the window, watching Greg make his rounds. "She's a piece of work, that one," he muttered. "She's trying to break you." Other neighbors just looked away when I saw them, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. They knew it was wrong, but Diane had them all scared. The fines kept coming. The threats of liens and daily inspections became my new reality. My quiet life was over. The rage in my chest had cooled into a hard, cold knot. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was a hostile takeover, plain and simple. I couldn't sleep. One night, I found myself in my office, pulling up the county's public records website. I started with my own property deeds, confirming every survey marker, every legal description. Everything was exactly as I knew it was. My father had been meticulous. Then, on a hunch, I started looking into the HOA's recent filings. I scrolled through pages of meeting minutes, rezoning applications, and permit requests. It was all boring, bureaucratic language, intentionally dense and confusing. But I'm an engineer. I know how to read blueprints and technical documents. And that's when I saw it. Buried deep in a 200-page appendix for a land use variance proposal, I found a map. My stomach dropped. It showed my property, but it was different. A huge section of my fields, the very land Diane claimed was community property, had been rezoned. It wasn't zoned for residential use anymore. It was zoned for high-density commercial development. My blood ran cold. I clicked through more documents, my hands shaking slightly. It was all there, a master plan, quietly approved in a closed-door board meeting 6 months ago. They hadn't just moved a fence line. They had sold the air over my head. The plan laid out, in cold architectural detail, the construction of 10 commercial skyscrapers right on top of my family's land. Diane's petty campaign of fines and harassment wasn't the main attack. It was a distraction. While I was fighting over a few feet of grass, she had already given away the whole farm. And the worst part? The ink was already dry. It was all perfectly, horrifyingly legal. Hope vanished, crushed under the weight of 10 invisible towers. They were coming, and I was standing right in their shadow. For 2 days, I did nothing. The anger and the shock had burned out, leaving a hollow space in my chest. I just sat at my kitchen table, the county planning document spread out like a funeral shroud. 10 skyscrapers. It was so absurd, so completely out of proportion to the petty fence line arguments, that it felt like something from a nightmare. The fight had changed. It wasn't about property lines anymore. It was about survival. On the third morning, I put on my steel-toed boots, grabbed a hard hat from my workshop, and walked out to the edge of my field. The surveyors were back, pounding stakes into the ground with grim efficiency. A site foreman in a bright orange vest was looking at a set of rolled-up blueprints. I walked right up to him. He looked me over, saw the hard hat and the calm look on my face, and assumed I was with one of the subcontractors. I didn't correct him. "Morning," I said, my voice level. "Mind if I see the permits for this phase?" He grunted, pulling a thick plastic binder from the cab of his truck. He handed it over. "All there," he said, already turning back to his work. I stood there for half an hour, flipping through the pages. As an engineer, I knew what I was looking at. Every form was filled out. Every signature was in place. Every city and county stamp was there, embossed and official. Diane had done her homework. She had used the HOA's legal team to push this through every bureaucratic loophole she could find. It was a masterpiece of paperwork, a fortress built of lies, but with a foundation of technically correct permits. Fighting this in court would be financial suicide. I would be buried in legal fees long before a judge ever saw the case. They had me, and they knew it. I handed the binder back to the foreman. "Looks like you're good to go," I said. He just nodded, not even looking up. I walked back to my house with a cold clarity I hadn't felt before. The rage was gone, replaced by a deep, chilling focus. Passive resistance was pointless. Arguing was a waste of breath. My only path forward was to find a weakness in their fortress. The community tension was a quiet poison seeping through the neighborhood. Some people, the ones who had been on the receiving end of Diane's wrath before, would give me a quick, sad nod when they saw me getting the mail. It was a silent apology, a look that said, "I'm with you, but I can't afford to be." Others, the ones who were either on her good side or just didn't want the trouble, would suddenly find something interesting across the street when I walked by. Maria felt it the worst. She stopped wanting to sit in the backyard. The sound of the machinery and the sight of strange trucks parked along our road made her anxious. She looked at me one evening, her eyes wide with a question I couldn't answer yet. "Dad, are we going to have to move?" Seeing that fear in her eyes was the final switch. The thought of running, of letting Diane Wexler push my daughter out of her own home, was unacceptable. That evening, my neighbor Tom Granger came over. He didn't bring coffee this time. He brought a satellite image he had printed from a GIS mapping service, the kind contractors use. He spread it out on my table. "Look at this, Jack," he said, his finger tracing a faint line on the map. "This is the old county easement for the sewer line they put in back in the 70s. It cuts right through where they're planning to put Tower 3. I looked closer. He was right. It was an old, almost forgotten detail, but it was on the official county record. Her survey, Tom continued, his voice low, the one she paid for, it conveniently ignores this. They're planning to lay $1 billion foundation on a 20-foot wide strip of land they don't have the full rights to. It wasn't much. In the grand scheme of things, it was a tiny crack in a massive wall, but it was a start. It was an error. And if they made one error, they likely made others. After Tom left, I sat alone in the quiet of my office. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel helpless. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. I wasn't thinking about how to stop them anymore. A new idea was forming, audacious and risky, but it felt right. Let them come. Let them dig their foundations and pour their concrete. Let them spend hundreds of millions of dollars building their shiny towers on my land. Let them think they've won. Because every truckload of steel, every pane of glass they hoisted into the sky, would be another block in a trap of my own design. I started sketching, not plans for a defense, but for an attack they would never see coming. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The room was packed. Diane stood at the podium, basking in the glow of what she saw as her great victory. She spoke of progress, of increased property values, of the bright new future this development would bring to our community. She talked about overcoming minor obstacles and dealing with residents resistant to change. And though she didn't use my name, everyone in the room knew who she was talking about. She had a smug, self-congratulatory tone that made my skin crawl. Greg Mallory and Ellie Parks sat behind her at the main table, looking like proud disciples. I sat in the back, silent, just watching. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't object. I let her have her moment. I watched her preen and posture, accepting the polite applause from the neighbors, who were too scared to do anything else. She thought this was the end of the story. She thought she had already won. As she wrapped up her speech, her eyes scanned the room and met mine. She gave me a tiny, triumphant smirk. I just looked back at her, my face a perfect blank. She was playing checkers, moving her pieces one obvious square at a time. I was playing chess, and I was giving her the queen for free, just to set up the board. The quiet I had taken for granted my whole life was gone. It was replaced by a constant grinding symphony of progress. The day started at dawn with the piercing shriek of backup alarms on heavy machinery. All day, the ground vibrated with the thud of pile drivers, and a fine film of dust settled on everything. The windowsills, the leaves in Mariah's garden, the water in the dog's bowl. It felt like a slow-motion home invasion. The skeletal frames of the skyscrapers began to climb, blotting out the morning sun, casting long, cold shadows across my yard long before dusk. They weren't just building on my fields, they were stealing the sky. While this monumental theft was happening in plain sight, Diane Wexler was busy with her ground war. She couldn't let me have a moment of peace. The petty citations escalated, becoming more and more absurd. Greg Mallory must have been given a quota. One morning, I found a notice on my door fining me $50 because my trash can was, and I quote, visible from the street for a period exceeding 4 hours post-collection. Another time, he wrote me up because the bird feeder my wife had hung from the old oak tree was, apparently, no longer in compliance with a bylaw amendment they had passed 2 weeks ago. My pickup truck, which I had parked in the same spot on my driveway for 15 years, was suddenly an unapproved commercial vehicle, and I was ordered to park it in the garage. These weren't just notices. They were tiny daily assertions of her power, little reminders that she was in control. My relationship started to fray under the strain. Maria's teachers called. Her grades were slipping. The constant noise made it hard for her to concentrate on her homework, and the stress of it all hung over our house like the dust from the construction site. She had a friend whose parents suddenly wouldn't let her come over to our house anymore. They didn't say why, but they didn't have to. Fear is contagious, and Diane was the one spreading the disease. Tom Granger still came by, but he was more cautious. We'd talk in my workshop instead of the front yard, his voice lowered as if the walls had ears. He told me other neighbors were being targeted with similar petty fines for the first time, a clear warning shot to anyone who might think of siding with me. Stay quiet, or you're next. That was the message. I saw the fracture lines running through our once solid community. People I'd known for decades would now just offer a tight-lipped nod and hurry on their way. I was being isolated, cut off from the herd to make me an easier target. But while Diane was busy playing with her clipboard and her rulebook, I was working. My anger had cooled and hardened into something more useful, a methodical, patient resolve. I wasn't going to fight her on her terms. I was going to build a case, piece by piece, out of her own arrogance. I started simple. I bought a small, quiet drone, the kind hobbyists use. Every morning at 7, just as the work crews arrived, I'd send it up. I flew it just high enough to get a clear, wide shot of my property line. And I started a photographic record. There was the supply truck that parked halfway on my lawn, crushing the sprinkler heads. Click. There was the pile of rebar and construction debris that spilled over the temporary fencing and onto my land. Click. There was the portable toilet they placed 10 feet inside my property line because it was more convenient for them. Click. I took hundreds of photos, each one automatically time-stamped and geotagged by the drone's software. They were clear, undeniable proof of daily, continuous trespassing. Next, I focused on the paper trail. Every email from Diane, every fine notice delivered by Greg, every vaguely threatening letter from the HOA's lawyer was saved. I created a separate folder on my computer for each one. I scanned the paper notices and saved them as PDFs. I printed out the emails and put them in a binder. It felt like I was documenting a crime scene, which, in a way, I was. Diane thought her words were weapons to intimidate me. She had no idea I was treating them as evidence she was handing me herself. My evenings were spent online, not stewing in anger, but digging through public records. It's amazing what you can find if you're patient. I wasn't looking for a silver bullet anymore. I was looking for loose threads. I cross-referenced the main construction company's permit numbers with their subcontractor filings. I found that one of the electrical subs had a license that had expired 2 weeks before they started work on Tower 4. Another subcontractor, the one pouring foundations, had 3 pending safety violations with the state board that hadn't been disclosed on their application with the HOA. These were small things, administrative errors they never thought a homeowner would find. But they showed a pattern of sloppiness, of cutting corners. They showed that the perfect fortress of paperwork Diane had built wasn't as solid as she thought. One afternoon, I was out back, measuring the distance from a surveyor's stake to my foundation. More data for my files when the site foreman stormed over. He was a big guy with a flushed face, and he was not happy. "You need to stop flying that toy over my work site," he barked, pointing up at the sky where my drone was hovering. "You're interfering with my operations." I just looked at him, then looked down at the stake he was standing next to, which was a good 20 feet on my side of the line. "And you need to get your crew and your equipment off my property," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "You're interfering with my life." His face got redder. He sputtered for a moment, then spun around and marched off, pulling out his phone. I knew who he was calling. The next move came 2 days later, delivered by certified mail. It was a thick envelope from a fancy downtown law firm. Inside was a letter, dripping with legal jargon that made my blood run cold. They were threatening to file a construction lien, not on the Skyscrapers, on my house. They were accusing me of tortious interference with a commercial contract and willful disruption of a permitted construction project. The letter claimed that my documentation and my hostile attitude were causing delays, and that if I didn't stop immediately, the developer, in partnership with the HOA, would hold me financially responsible for any and all cost overruns. They were going to use the billion-dollar price tag of their project as a club to take my home, the one I had paid for 30 years ago. It was the most ridiculously backwards threat I had ever seen, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that Diane was just arrogant enough to try it. That letter was a gut punch. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt the cold sting of genuine fear. It wasn't about the fines or the harassment anymore. They were coming for my house, for my daughter's home. The quiet resolve I'd built over the past few weeks cracked, and a flood of despair rushed in. I sat at my desk, staring at the lawyer's letterhead, and the sheer scale of the fight ahead felt insurmountable. I was just one man, a retired engineer with a mortgage, up against a multi-million-dollar development corporation and an HOA with a bottomless war chest funded by my own neighbors' dues. They could afford to drag this out in court for years, bleeding me dry with motions and filings until I had nothing left. They could bury me, and the lien was how they were going to do it. The worst part was seeing the toll it was taking on Maria. She had stopped going out to her garden altogether. The constant presence of the work crews, the noise, the feeling of being watched, it was too much. She'd come home from school and go straight to her room, putting on headphones to block out the world. One night at dinner, she just pushed her food around her plate, silent. Finally, she looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we should just go, Dad. Maybe we should sell the house and move somewhere else. It's not worth it." Her words hit me harder than any legal threat. She was willing to give up her home, the only home she'd ever known, just to make it stop. I had failed. I had let this fight poison the one place she was supposed to feel safe. My stubbornness was hurting my own child. The thought of it was a lead weight in my stomach. The very next day, I called a real estate agent. I couldn't even look Maria in the eye when I did it. The agent came over, a cheerful woman, who tried her best to be optimistic, but even she couldn't hide the reality of the situation. "With the ongoing construction," she said, choosing her words carefully, "and the dispute with the homeowners association, you'd be looking at a significant loss. People don't want to buy into a war zone. Significant loss." That was the polite way of saying I'd have to give away my father's legacy for pennies on the dollar just to escape. I felt hollowed out, defeated. Tom Granger saw the real estate agent's car in my driveway and came over later that evening. He didn't say much. He just sat with me in the garage, listening as I laid it all out. When I was done, he just shook his head slowly. "Don't let her win, Jack. Don't you dare let that woman chase you out of your own home." But his words felt distant, like encouragement shouted from a faraway shore. My fight was gone. Meanwhile, Diane Wexler was on top of the world. The latest HOA newsletter arrived in our mailboxes, and on the front page was a glossy, professionally taken photograph of her. She was standing in front of the rising skeletons of the Skyscrapers, wearing a hard hat and a triumphant smile, flanked by two executives from the development company. The headline read, "A Bold New Future. President Wexler delivers on promise of progress." The article was a masterpiece of propaganda, praising her vision and unwavering leadership in securing a project that would supposedly bring prosperity to the whole community. It mentioned how she had skillfully navigated complex zoning challenges and overcome minor procedural hurdles. It was a victory lap, printed in full color and delivered to every door in the neighborhood. She wasn't just building towers on my land. She was building her own legend on my defeat. She was basking in the glory, completely unaware and unconcerned with the wreckage she was leaving behind. I folded up the newsletter and threw it in the trash. It was over. I would take the loss, get my daughter somewhere quiet and safe, and try to forget this place ever existed. I had the agent's number on my desk, ready to make the call the next morning and tell her to list the property. I went to bed that night, feeling nothing but the heavy ache of surrender. Just before I drifted off, my phone buzzed. It was an email from an anonymous address, just a random string of letters and numbers. There was no subject line. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but something made me open it. The message was short, just 2 sentences. "They cut corners on the foundation for Tower 3. Check the rebar inspection filings from last month. They don't match the on-site pour logs. And that was it. No name, no explanation. Just a tiny, specific clue. It was a thread. A loose thread hanging from the edge of Diane's perfect tapestry. It was probably nothing, a crank email from a disgruntled construction worker. But it was also the first glimmer of light I'd seen in weeks. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe the foundation of their entire project had a crack in it. Maybe it wasn't over. Not yet. That anonymous email changed everything. The despair evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in years. I didn't call the real estate agent. Instead, I spent the entire next day in the county clerk's office, digging through physical records. The rebar inspection filings were public, but buried under layers of procedural paperwork. It took hours, but I found them. Then I found the concrete pour logs from the contractor. Just as the email said, they didn't match. The inspection report, signed off by a city official, certified a certain grade and spacing of steel reinforcement. But the pour logs, which detailed the actual materials used on site, showed they had used a cheaper grade of rebar, spaced wider apart. It was a classic cost-cutting cheat, the kind that saves a contractor a few $100,000, but could compromise the structural integrity of a 50-story building. This wasn't just a paperwork error, this was fraud, and it was happening on land they had effectively stolen from me. The fear was gone. The calm, cold determination was back, sharper than ever. I wasn't going to sell. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't just going to stop them, I was going to own them. My plan was no longer about finding leverage to halt construction. It was about letting them finish the job and then taking control. It was a high-wire act, legally and financially, and it had to be executed perfectly. The first step was the most crucial. The entire skyscraper. Project was built on a legal fiction, that the HOA had clear title and development rights to my fields. My own deed proved that was a lie. Tom's discovery about the old county sewer easement under Tower 3 was another crack in their claim. Now, with the fraudulent inspection report, I had evidence of illegal activity happening on my land. I took this information not to a confrontational lawyer, but to a quiet, methodical title attorney who specialized in complex commercial real estate. He listened to my story without interruption, reviewed my documents, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "they haven't just built on your land. They've built on a foundation of quicksand. Their entire claim is contestable." He explained it in simple terms. The developer's financing, their insurance, their very right to occupy those buildings all depended on having a clean, undisputed title to the land underneath. My claim, backed by my original deed and their fraudulent activity, clouded that title completely. The next phase required capital. I didn't have the kind of money to fight a corporation head-on, but I didn't need to. I took out a second mortgage on my house, a huge risk, but I was past the point of caution. I cashed in some old investments my father had left me. I gathered every penny I had. Then, with the help of my attorney, I formed a shell company. Just a name on a piece of paper, an LLC with an anonymous-sounding title that had no connection to me. This was vital. I had to move in the shadows. Through this new company, I began to act. The developer, confident in their victory, had already started pre-selling commercial leases for the office and retail space in the towers. My LLC made an offer. We offered to buy a controlling interest in the commercial lots themselves, not the buildings, but the ground leases for the land they sat on. To the developer, it must have looked like a simple cash out, an investor wanting to get in on their successful project. They didn't know the person behind the offer was the man whose land they were standing on. Their arrogance was my camouflage. While the lawyers handled the financial maneuvering, I made my move on the ground. I started talking to the subcontractors, not the foremen or the site managers, but the crew leaders, the guys pouring the concrete, the electricians, the plumbers. I'd show up at the local diner where they got coffee before their shifts. I didn't threaten them or talk about the law. I talked their language. I showed the rebar discrepancy to a grizzled old concrete finisher. He looked at the documents, looked at me, and just slowly shook his head. "They're going to have cracks in that foundation before the windows are in," he said. I explained that when this all came to light, the developer and the primary contractor would throw the subcontractors under the bus. Their payments would be frozen. They'd be tied up in lawsuits for years. But, I offered, there was another way. I had them sign simple preemptive agreements. These weren't employment contracts. They were promissory notes. When I took control, my company would not only guarantee their outstanding payments, but would also offer them contracts for the building's maintenance and future tenant fit-outs. I was turning the developer's own workforce into my future allies. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They signed. All this happened in the space of a few weeks, a silent, furious storm of activity happening just beneath the surface. On the outside, nothing had changed. The towers kept climbing higher, the dust kept settling on my windows, and Greg Mallory kept leaving his little love notes on my door. Diane remained the triumphant queen of the neighborhood. She was so confident, so wrapped up in her victory, that she couldn't see the ground shifting under her feet. Then one evening, my phone rang. It was her. Her voice was sharp, a little strained. "Jack," she said, without any preamble, "I hear you've been talking to the work crews. You need to stop." Someone had talked. It didn't matter. It was too late. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "It's my property, Diane," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I can talk to whoever I want." There was a hiss of angry breath on the other end of the line. "You have no idea what you're getting into. You keep pushing this, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. This is your final warning." She hung up. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat born of a dawning, terrifying realization. She didn't know what I was doing, not exactly, but she could feel something was wrong. She could feel the power shifting. The hunter was beginning to suspect that it had been walking into a trap all along. The HOA annual meeting was Diane's coronation. She had booked the largest room at the community clubhouse, and it was standing room only. She stood at a podium at the front, bathed in the slightly too bright fluorescent lights, looking regal. Greg and Ellie were seated behind her like a royal court, their faces beaming with reflected glory. My neighbors were there, most of them looking resigned, a few looking nervous. They had come for the free coffee and pastries and to hear their queen deliver her victory speech. I saw a couple of suits in the front row, lawyers for the developer, no doubt, there to put a corporate stamp of approval on the proceedings. I had also invited a guest of my own, a quiet reporter from the local business journal, who was very interested in a story about a major commercial development with a few irregularities. I sat in a metal folding chair in the very back, next to Tom Granger. I was just another homeowner in the crowd. Diane tapped the microphone, a shrill feedback squeal cutting through the room before she began. She spent 10 minutes praising her own tireless efforts and the board's unwavering commitment to progress. She painted a picture of a golden future for our neighborhood, one of soaring property values and renewed prestige, all thanks to the 10 glass towers that now blotted out the horizon. "There were some who resisted this change," she said, her eyes sweeping the room and lingering on me for a fraction of a second. "There were some who could not see the vision, but we persevered. We followed the rules, we adhered to the bylaws, and we have delivered a triumph for this entire community." The applause was polite, but not enthusiastic. It was the sound of people clapping because they felt they were supposed to. When she finished, she opened the floor for questions. A few hands went up to ask about garbage collection schedules and the new parking rules. It was all business as usual. Then, when there was a lull, I stood up. I didn't raise my hand. I just walked calmly to the microphone set up in the aisle. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. Diane's smile became a thin, hard line. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have a question about your fines?" "No, Diane," I said, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the cheap speaker system. "This is more of a point of information, an update really, for the board, the developers' representatives, and all my neighbors here tonight." I paused, letting the silence stretch. I could see the developers' lawyers shift in their seats, exchanging a confused glance. "As you all know," I continued, "this entire project was built on the premise that the HOA had secured the legal development rights for the land those 10 towers now occupy." I held up a single folded document. It was a certified copy of my father's original deed. The first problem is that the HOA's claim was based on a flawed survey. This deed, filed with the county 70 years ago, proves that the land was, and always has been, private property. My private property. A murmur went through the crowd. Diane gripped the sides of the podium, her knuckles white. "That is a settled matter, Jack. The courts have—" I cut her off, my voice never rising. No, they haven't, because it was never taken to court. It was pushed through planning and zoning with paperwork that obscured the truth. I held up a second document, the GIS map Tom had found. The second problem is that even if you ignore my deed, you built Tower 3 directly on top of a county sewer easement you never had the rights to disturb, a rather significant oversight. The developers' lawyers were no longer glancing at each other. They were staring at me, their faces suddenly pale. Diane opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't finished. This was the moment I had been working toward, the final piece of the trap. These issues created something the financial world calls a clouded title. It means the ownership of the land is in dispute, and when a title is clouded, the value of that land plummets. No sane investor wants to touch it. I looked directly at the developer's lawyers. Now, this brings me to my final point. I pulled a third, much thicker document from my jacket pocket. A few weeks ago, a private investment LLC took advantage of that situation. They quietly purchased the controlling interest in the ground leases for all 10 commercial plots from the original property group. They got them for a very, very good price. The room was dead silent. You could hear the hum of the overhead lights. I let my eyes drift from the lawyers back to Diane. Her face had gone from smug to confused to the color of ash. I am the sole owner of that LLC, I said, my voice dropping just a little, but carrying to every corner of the room. As of 9 a.m. last Tuesday I am, for all legal intents and purposes, the developer's new landlord. Those aren't your skyscrapers, Diane. They're my tenants, and they're already 2 weeks behind on the rent. The sound that followed was a collective gasp. Diane stared at me, her mouth hanging open, utterly speechless. For the first time in her life, she had no response, no rule to cite, no threat to make. Her power, built on a mountain of paper and bluff, had just been demolished by 3 simple documents. Greg Mallory looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Ellie Parks was staring at her hands, refusing to look up. Tom Granger had a grin on his face so wide I thought his head might split open. Diane finally found her voice, a choked, strangled sound. "You can't. That's illegal. You cheated." "No, Diane," I said, placing the papers gently on the table next to the microphone. "It was just a smarter business deal. You were so busy bullying one homeowner over a bird feeder that you gave away $1 billion development. You played checkers. I played chess. That was it. The final blow. Her authority, her reputation, everything she had built, shattered in an instant, in front of everyone she had ever tried to intimidate. She looked around the room, her eyes wild, searching for an ally, a friendly face, anything. But all she saw were the shocked, and in some cases, gleeful faces of her neighbors. She had been publicly and completely humiliated. With a raw cry of fury and shame, she shoved the podium aside, the microphone thudding to the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice cracking. "You think you've won? You will regret this." And with that, she turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her. The meeting was over. But as the stunned silence gave way to a rising buzz of questions and excited chatter, I knew the war wasn't. I knew Diane wouldn't go quietly. A person like that, whose entire identity is built on power and control, doesn't just walk away when they lose. They lash out. And I was ready. The day after the meeting, I had high-resolution security cameras installed around my property, the kind that give you a crystal-clear picture, even in the dark. It felt like an admission that my home was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. But I had a feeling I was going to need them. The first move was laughably clumsy. A package arrived, addressed to the lead inspector's city planning department, but delivered to my house. The return address was Diane's. I didn't open it. I called the police and the city inspector's office. When they opened it in my driveway, it was full of cash and a typed note offering a generous bonus to whoever could find a fatal flaw in my LLC's paperwork. It was a ham-fisted attempt at bribery and framing me all at once. The police took notes, took the box, and left. It was stupid, but it showed how desperate she was. A few nights later, the motion sensors on my new cameras went off around 2 a.m. I pulled up the feed on my phone. The image was perfectly clear under the infrared light. Diane Wexler, dressed in dark clothing, was trying to pry open the lock on my workshop with a crowbar. It was surreal. The powerful HOA president, reduced to a common burglar in the middle of the night. She was probably looking for my documents, thinking she could steal the evidence of her own defeat. I called 911, and I just watched the feed. I watched as she struggled with the lock, getting more and more frustrated. I watched as the flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of my street, and I watched the look of pure, panicked shock on her face as she realized she was caught. She dropped the crowbar and tried to run, but it was too late. 2 officers had her in handcuffs before she made it to the sidewalk. The footage of her pathetic attempt, from 4 different angles, was downloaded and saved before the police car was even out of sight. The arrest was the final nail in her coffin. The story, along with a still from my security footage, was on the front page of the local paper the next morning. My reporter friend from the Business Journal ran a devastating expose on the whole scheme, detailing the fraudulent paperwork, the clouded title, and the HOA's gross mismanagement. The fallout was immediate and total. The developer, facing their own lawsuits and a PR nightmare, publicly severed all ties with Diane and the HOA board. At an emergency meeting called by the homeowners, a motion of no confidence was passed unanimously. Diane was stripped of her presidency. Greg Mallory and Ellie Parks, seeing the writing on the wall, resigned on the spot. The House of Cards had collapsed. The new interim board, led by a relieved and slightly overwhelmed Tom Granger, immediately voted to nullify every fine and violation Diane had ever issued against me. Just like that, years of harassment were wiped clean from the record. My lawyer sent the formal lease agreements to the corporate offices of the businesses that now occupied my towers. There was no negotiation. The terms were clear. They were on my land, and rent was due on the 1st of the month. The first wire transfer that hit my LLC's bank account was for more money than my father made in his entire life. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the justice. It was the sound of the world finally being set right. The financial balance was restored, but more importantly, the emotional balance in our neighborhood began to heal. People started talking to each other again. The fear was gone. Neighbors who had been afraid to even look at me were now stopping by to shake my hand, bringing over cookies and pies. They weren't just being friendly. They were celebrating a shared victory. They had seen a bully toppled, and it had reminded them that they had a voice, that they had power when they stood together. One sunny Saturday afternoon, I was in the backyard. The noise of construction was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of lawnmowers and kids laughing. Maria was there with me. She was kneeling in her garden, her hands in the soil, carefully tending to the flowers that were finally starting to bloom again. She looked up at me and smiled, a real, genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen in months. "It's quiet, Dad," she said. The land was safe, my family was safe, and my father's legacy was not only preserved, it had become the foundation for our future. A few weeks later, I threw a block party. The whole neighborhood came. We set up grills and tables in the cul-de-sac, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like a community again. I had commissioned a small, simple bronze plaque. I mounted it on one of the old stone posts that marked the original entrance to my father's farm. It didn't mention Diane or the Skyscrapers. It just said, "Fair play restored." It was a promise to my father and to my neighbors that on this small piece of land, integrity had won.